Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lecture. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about economic gender inequality. Okay, so as I said, in this lesson, we're going to be talking about economic gender inequality. And then in the next lesson, we'll be talking about the representation of men and women in the media, in popular culture, and how that also can be sometimes unequal. So to kind of review for today's lesson, we're going to be talking about kind of three main things. First, I want to do kind of a review of the Moodle reading for today, the reading by Lorber, because this is actually a really succinct idea of a lot of the concepts that we're going to be looking at. Then we're going to be talking about the gender pay gap and focusing on the gender pay gap in the United States. And then lastly, we'll talk about the sources of the gender pay gap, right? Why is there a gap in the incomes of men and women? Okay, so first off, let's talk about the Lorber reading. And so the Lorber reading is really a good, succinct reading of a lot of concepts that sociologists talk about in terms of gender, right? And so, and she kind of breaks it down, and she really kind of writes in a very clear way. And so, let me kind of do kind of a review of some of the things she talks about. So, at the start of the reading, she really kind of does a kind of a general discussion of what it means to say that gender is socially constructed, right? This idea that gender is, something artificial. It can appear or seem natural, right? It just seems to us, or it seems to many people, that men and women are just different, right? But what the argument is that difference that we perceive is a difference that we as humans created, right, between men and women. And so she goes in, some good examples of, both the idea of gender socialization and gender as a performance. And I think one of the best examples of how both of these concepts kind of go together is her discussion of actually little girls and why parents put earrings on little girls, right? And so, she talks about this. You can see a baby, you can see an infant, somebody who's 3 months old, and you can say, oh, well, I don't know if this infant is a boy or girl. The person has a little hoodie, they're in a little bib. There's nothing really to distinguish their gender. But then you look and you see earrings, right? You say, oh, now I know. Now I know this is a little girl. And so, a couple of questions then come to mind is, why do parents do this? Why do parents put earrings on their daughters, right? Usually they're stick-on earrings, right? They're not usually pierced. But, we can ask, why bother doing it? So the first thing is it's a gender performance, right? It's not a performance that the infant or the girl herself picked, but it's a performance that was given to the daughter by their parents, right? The daughter is wearing a costume, right? She's wearing a prop that signifies to everybody, that communicates to everybody the girl's gender, right? And so it really is, it's a great example of a gender performance. It's a gender performance that happens at a very young age. Saying, who this girl is. And we can think of other simple examples of this, ribbons, putting ribbons in girls' hairs, because, the infants don't have a lot of hair, but, tying it up in a ribbon signifies, oh, this is, this girl's hair has got ribbon in it. Even things we talked about like color, pink for girls, blue for boys, right? And so it's a great example of a gender performance. It's a way that a person is presenting themselves, to the public, to other people, to show and symbolize their gender. But it's also an example of gender socialization, right? It's an example of how this performance of gender is ingrained from a very young age, right? That one of the first things we do is we say, what gender is this person, right? And after we just kind of categorize somebody, then we kind of gets ingrained in the person. And Lorber has this kind of nice point that she makes where she says, look, it kind of makes people feel uncomfortable when they don't know a person's gender, right? When we don't know if the infant is a boy or a girl, we are disquieted, right? It makes us feel uneasy in a way. Maybe less so now than when Lorber wrote this article, but this idea that not being able to categorize somebody in terms of their gender is something that can sometimes be upsetting to people. Right, so Lorber really starts off her article and she talks about this idea of gender socialization and gender as a performance. Then she has this really interesting section where she says, okay, for individuals, gender means sameness. And so we can say to ourselves, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to say that gender means sameness? And really, I think essentially the idea here is that once we construct gender, we're basically asking individuals to conform to those gender roles. We're asking a woman to be like all the other women, right? We're asking a man to be manly, to be like all the other men. And so for an individual experience, the experience of a gender is conformity, right? To be the same, to conform to the expectations of your gender, right? To take on that role, to take on that identity. But what she says is interesting is that, so whereas gender means sameness for the individuals, right? It means conformity and being the same as your gender, for society, right? For the society at large, gender means difference, right? So what we can ask ourselves, what does she mean by that? Well, really, it means that we're categorizing men and women as being separate, right? We're putting men and women into boxes, right? Men over here, women over here, and we're splitting them apart, right? We're saying that they are separate, right? They are not just they're not just the same people with different bodies, but just completely different people, right? We are, pushing them apart. And so it's really an interesting thing, right? It's, for the individual, gender means conforming to your gender, but for society writ large, gender means separating out men and women into two different groups. And so we really see here that this means that gender is, a social construction. It's something artificial. She makes an argument quite clearly that, this is not from biology. This is not from physiology. This is not from, some chemistry or natural, just the way things are. This is artificial, right? This separation of men and women is something that we have done to ourselves. But to lead us into the topic of today, the last thing that we have to understand is that once we accept that gender is something artificial, once we accept that gender is socially constructed, the next thing that we have to understand is that that social construction is not equal, right? It's not just that we separate out the genders, but in addition, we also treat them unequally, right? Historically and into contemporary times, we have treated women as lower than men. Right? We have created a hierarchy between men and women in which men are at the top of that hierarchy. And so she says this quite succinctly, right? The devaluation of women and the social domination of men is not something natural. It's not because of physiology or chemistry or biology, right? It is something that is produced and maintained by social processes, right? That really is, what we're talking about in terms of social construction, right? That this is, this construction of the inequality of men and women is something that's not a natural outcome of the differences between men and women, but it is an outcome that we made, right? That we created. So really brings us into this idea that, the part of the social construction of gender is the inequality of that result of that in construction. Okay, so how are we going to see this today? What's the way that we can see and witness the inequality of the social construction of gender around the world and in America. So what I want to focus on today is economic gender inequality. And we can really think about this and kind of sum this up through what's called the gender pay gap, right? Inequality in terms of income. And so here we see the gender pay gap around the world. So this is data from 2016, right? So I want to mention, actually, I'm going to be showing you a lot of graphs and figures and data today. Don't get lost in the data, but just remember, keep a track of what the numbers are telling you. What's the story that it's telling you, right? So we can see here, what's the story that it's telling us here? Well, it's telling us a couple of things. We can see that all over the world, men earn more money than women, right? It's a clear example of this inequality, right? That if we look at the wages of men and women, we see across the world that men earn more money than women, right? But the second story is that this graph is telling us is that there's a variability in that, right? So in South Korea, we see that women earn about 36% less than men, right? So that's a huge gap. But in places like Italy and Greece, the gap is very small. Women and men nearly earn the same amount of money, right? But what this really telling us is, why is it variable? Because it's artificial. This is not something natural or preordained. There's differences in the gender pay gap because the gender pay gap is something that is produced by society. And if there's different societies, it means the gender pay gap is going to be different in those different societies, right? And so we can look, okay, well, where is the United States? And we can see that the United States is pretty much in the middle, right? It's kind of OECD countries, kind of industrialized countries. The United States is pretty much in the middle of the pack, right? And so we can say, more recent data from 2019, right? We can see that women make about 82 cents for every dollar a man makes, right? So when a man makes a dollar at his work, a woman will make 82 cents, right? And so we see that, it's not massive. It's not like as bad as South Korea, but it's not as small as somewhere like Italy or Greece, right? So kind of like in the middle. Let's break down this number a little bit more, right? So this is the basic number, right? The gender pay gap in America is that women make about 82 cents for every dollar a man makes. So let's kind of look into this a little bit more closely, right? So one way we can think about this is what's called the Equal Pay Day. And this is data from 2019, essentially because 2020 has been such a messed up year in terms of wages and labor that we don't quite know. We can't quite know to get the results, good data yet. But basically, what way to sum up the gender pay gap is to talk about what's called the Equal Pay Day, right? And so the Equal Pay Day is this idea that in 2019, women had to work until April 2nd, right, to earn the same amount of money that men worked up until in the whole year of 2018, right? So that women basically or essentially had to work 3 more months, right, to make the same amount of money that men made, in the previous year, right? So instead of taking a 3-month holiday, right, women had to keep on working, for those 3 months, even just to earn the same amount of wages that men were making. Right? So that's one way to kind of visualize or think about the gender pay gap. But we can also understand that the gender pay gap is not just the same in terms of, it's not just 82 cents for everybody, but it varies by race, right? That gender and race intersect, right, and create different forms or different amounts of inequality, right? So here's data from 2017, right? So we're trying to use the most recent data we have, but sometimes you have data from 7 years and more recent than others. So this is pretty recent, 2017. And so what we see is this is all of women's earnings compared to white men. So you have to compare it to somebody And so you're comparing it to white men. And so what you see here is that, okay, women are on average earning less than white men, but there's a fair amount of variability, right? So Asian women are nearly earning the same or similar amount to white men. White women are earning about 79 cents for every dollar white man works. And then we can see Black women and Hispanic women are then earning considerably less, right? About 67 cents for every dollar, and then 58 cents for every dollar, right? So that's nearly getting to be about half the wages of a white man. And so we can see that race and gender are intersecting, right? Are creating multiple forms of inequality. Right. And so to go back briefly, what can happen then is, somebody, it's kind of like a double jeopardy. Somebody can get hurt because of their gender and also because of their race in terms of the income they can expect to earn. Okay. Now we can look at it in terms of education. This is an important kind of slide, right? So normally when I do this class in person, I show this graph and, I ask people to tell me, what it means. Unfortunately, I can't do that. But, I can give people, a moment or two to come look over this graph, right? So what we are seeing here is that this is a graph of men and women's earnings, right? By their level of education. So one basic thing we see here is that, the more education you have, the more money you're going to earn. And that's not surprising. That's what we expect. You're right. You get the more education you have, you get a college degree, you get a graduate degree, you're going to get a better job that pays you more money, right? That more education pays you, gets you a better job. I know we see that's being true for both men and women. The more education they have, the more their income goes up. But what we're interested in is not just that education, what's happening with the increase in education, but the gap, what's happening between a gap between men and women, right? So does education make the gap go away, right? So if women are educated, right, does that mean that, do educated women earn as much money as educated men? Right, and all we have to do is make sure that women are, have enough education to allow them to get good paying jobs. No, that actually doesn't seem to be the case. Actually, if anything, the gap in income actually gets larger when education increases, right? And so what we see here is that when both men and women have less than a high school degree, right, so a low level of education, then the gap is about 80%. But then as they get more education, right, as their educational levels increase, the gap between men and women actually gets larger, right? By the time they have a bachelor's degree, it's increased slightly to 77%. By the time they get a professional degree, like a law degree or something like that, then the gap has actually increased to 72%. And so the main point here is it's not the case that men are working skilled jobs that require an education, whereas women are not, right? That's not the explanation for, the gender pay gap. Rather is, even when men and women both have high levels of education, women are still earning less education, less money than men. And so another way to think about this is to say, yes, education increases your income, but for women, they get less of a benefit than men. Right? When men increase their education, they get a boost in their income that's greater than or more than the boost that women get. Right? And so, education doesn't increase the income gains as much for women as it does for men. Okay, so that's by so we see it here by race, we see it here by education. Now we can also look by age, and here we're coming across this idea of what's called the glass ceiling. So this is the gender pay gap over life course. So again, I typically what I would do is ask people to tell me, what the numbers are saying, right? But you can look at this chart. I think it's pretty clear. What we see here is that in the early part of people's lives, when they're teenagers or in their 20s or even the early 30s, the gap is not that great, right? Particularly in the 20s. What's happening here is everybody is earning lower income, right? People are just starting off their careers, so they're getting beginning jobs, jobs that are of a lower income. And so men and women are starting off at both at that kind of low income level. And so they're earning kind of a similar amount of money. But then something happens around the 30s, right? 30s and 40s, 50s, then the gap widens, right? We see the gap get bigger, right? At that point, what we see is that men start to earn more income than women, right? So up until about age 31, women are paid about 90% of the wages that men earn, right? But then after that, then the gap really gets bigger, right? We can see this in another graph here, right? And this graph is basically telling you the same story as the previous one, but just with a bar graph rather than a line graph. But what it's really showing you is this idea of a glass ceiling, right? That women are, right, they're going through their careers, they're getting into a company or some office, right? And through their 20s and early 30s, they get some promotions, they get raises. But at some point in their early 30s or mid 30s, that stops. They stop getting promoted as much. They stop getting raises as much. They make it to mid-level, but they don't make it to vice president or CFO or some higher level upper management. But men do, right? Men keep on getting those promotions up until their late 30s and into their 40s, right? And so this essentially is the idea of a glass ceiling, that women at some point hit this invisible ceiling, right, that they bump up against, and they stop getting promotions, they stop getting raises, and so their lifetime earnings then are not as high as men. Whereas men are allowed to pass through, they're allowed to keep getting those raises and keep getting those promotions. And so what that means is that then over the life course, men will earn more money than men. Men will earn more money than women. And so what this means that is over a person's life course, on average, a man will earn about $400,000 more money than a woman will earn, right? If you add up all the wages and average promotions. Right? So this idea of a glass ceiling, right? That women are hitting an invisible wall or ceiling of getting promotions, raises that men do not hit, which allows them to keep getting those raises and earn more money over their life course. Okay, so we've seen it so far in terms of the gender pay gap in terms of race, education, and by age. One last thing I want to mention is we can think about labor not just in terms of paid labor, right, what you do for your job, but we also can think of labor in terms of unpaid labor. This is what everybody dislikes, housework, right? So what we see here is that it used to be the case that women were more likely to stay at home and take care of the house and raise children, where men were out and expected to work at a job. Then around the 1960s and 70s, there was a pretty distinct change in the labor market, and which now both men and women work externally or outside the home. Generally speaking, on average, most men and women are working, outside the home, right? And so what you would think then is as men and women now both work outside the home, now it means that they would now both share in the care of the home, right? That they would do a similar amount of housework, right? And so what we see is that while the rate of men doing housework has increased over the decades, they do much more now than they did in the 1960s or 70s, it is nowhere near equality, right? And so men on average spend about an hour and 20 minutes a day on chores, right? So this is everything from cleaning, cooking, taking care of children, whereas women spend about 2 hours and 10 minutes a day on chores. And so this equals up to about 6 more hours a week for women than men in terms of taking care of the house. So it's almost, you think about it as another day of work, right? And so we can say, oh, well, what's the main difference? What's really taking up more of women's time? Right? What's forcing them to take up more time? It really seems to be cooking and cleaning, right? It's food preparation and cleanup, and basically housework or cleaning, right? And other things, men are doing things like going out and getting things, travel for chores and stuff like that. But it's the cooking and cleaning, which is the basic things. And this has a lot to do with just basically gender norms or gender socialization, right? What is women's work and what is men's work, and what is expected of men and women. This idea of men can go drive in a car and go get something, but it's women's work to cook and to clean, right? And so then we can see that that's taking up many more minutes, in terms of somebody's life, than driving to go get something, right? And so what we see here is that not only are women working outside the home for less money than men, they're working inside the home more often, right, than men, or more minutes. Okay, so this is the gender pay gap. And what I would argue is that a lot of this is indisputable, right? These are facts, right? Women get paid less money than men, right? There's not a lot of, I don't think that there's a lot of disagreement about this. Sometimes people will argue about how much and how and things like that, but that the gender pay gap exists, I think, is indisputable. Oh, the last thing I want to mention, right? What's happening to the gender pay gap over time, right? The gender pay gap is shrinking. It's kind of ending on some more positive news, right? Hopeful news, right? In the 1990s, even before the 1990s, really 1960s, 1970s, the gender pay gap was about 60 cents, right? Women were earning 60 cents for every dollar. And we see in the 1990s, it was about 72 cents, right? And so the gender pay gap has shrunk over time, right? We are reaching equality. Women's wages have gone up and gotten closer to the wages that men have earned, right? So there is a greater degree of equality. However, right, parity or complete equality is still very, very far away, right? It's still going to be about 200 years before women earn exactly the same or equal amount of money that men earn, right? So equality is going up, the gap is shrinking, but there's a fair number of years to go before we reach full equality. Okay, so all these are facts, right? And I believe that they are pretty indisputable, right? That the gender pay gap exists is not something that people will really argue with that much, right? How much it is, how big the gap, people will argue about this. Economists will love to argue about these stats, statistics, and figures, but there is a gap, right? Now, what people really argue about is, why does the gap exist, right? Why is there a gender pay gap? And so here's really kind of the meat of the argument. And so some people will argue, some economists will argue is, this gap exists because of the choices that women make, right? Men and women are making choices about their lives, about their jobs, about their incomes, and women are simply making different choices than men. And so the result of the gender pay gap is really about the choices that men and women are making. And so I would say that that's the kind of the defense of the gender pay gap, right? An explanation that is charitable, right? A lot of what I'm going to argue today is that I actually don't think that that's a very good explanation, right? That we have to understand how choices are made and understand that society structures the choices that people make, right? That's, people sometimes choices are limited, and then people are pushed to make certain choices based on their gender. Okay, so let's get into the heart of it. What is the reason why there is this gender pay gap? And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about three main reasons. I'm going to go through them one by one. Okay, what's the first reason? The first reason is what's called occupational segregation. This is the idea that men and women work different jobs. And, we talked a little bit about this in a previous video lecture, right? The idea of gender roles, right? The idea that some professions are professions that are predominantly occupied by men, and other professions are occupations that are predominantly occupied by women, right? So some of the things I noted before was, nurses are 71% female, doctors are 91% male, firefighters are more often male, elementary school teachers are more often female, right? This is the idea of gender typing, right? That men and women tend to pick different occupations, right? Some occupations are similar, right? Men and women equally pick them, but some occupations, men and women are picking different jobs. Right? And so the idea here is that those jobs are getting paid different amounts of money, right? And so what some economists will argue is, see, this is just about choice, right? Women are simply picking jobs that are lower paying, right? And if they picked other jobs that were higher paying, then they would make a similar amount of money from as men, right? So occupational segregation explains about 50% or half of the gender pay gap. But let's kind of break this down a little bit more, right? So we know when men and women are picking different jobs. Here's one thing to understand though. As the percentage of women in a profession increases, that profession decreases. Okay? So that's not really about the choices of women. That's actually about the priorities of society. Right? And so as women tend to go into one profession, right, as they tend to occupy one profession, then society tends to value that profession less and to pay it less money. Right? So here we see a kind of a graph of this. Right? So what we see is as a profession is female dominated versus male dominated, then that profession, it gets paid less money, right? And they have some kind of examples of here. So first we can see, what about professions that require a high school degree? So less education than a bachelor's degree, right? And so we see, as women pick certain professions that just require a high school degree, right? Those professions are paid less. Right? And so it's not just about the choices, but it's about the priorities of society. That society tends to be valuing the work of women less than the work of men. This is not just true in terms of lower educational jobs, but also higher educational jobs, right? And so jobs that require a bachelor's degree, still that we find is as women work those certain professions more, those jobs are paid less. Kind of mechanical engineer versus an occupational therapist, right? And so again, the argument here is not about the choices of women, but about the priorities of society and what we value and who we value. Okay, so that's the first argument, right? Women are selecting, could say being pushed into jobs that pay less. As women pick those jobs, we pay them less money. Okay, so that's one explanation. Second explanation is what's called workforce participation, right? The number of hours that men and women are working and whether or not they're dropping out of the labor market. And so what we see here is two things. One is that on average, men work more hours than women, right? So women are more likely to work part-time, and men are to have a higher percentage of working full-time, right? Both men and women are most likely to work full-time, right? But women have a higher percentage of sometimes working part-time, right? And so the idea here is that men are working longer hours than women, right? Are more likely to be working full-time and predominantly more likely not to drop out of the labor market for, say, a couple of years or some months, right? So again, what an economist might say is, oh, well, this is about choice, right? This is about men and women making different choices, and women are making the choice to work less hours and to drop out of the labor market for a period of time and then come back and work part-time. So then we can ask a pretty obvious kind of question. What's happening that's causing women to drop out of the labor market? What could be an important life event that would make a woman drop out of the labor market for a number of years and then come back and work part-time? It's having a child, right? So what's happening is that men and women are getting married and they're having children. And when they have that child, the wife is more likely to make a decision to drop out of the labor market for a year or 2 years, depending on how many children and et cetera, personal choice. And then when she comes back, she's more likely to take on less hours. And so then we have that. This raises the question then, why is it that women are dropping out of the labor market to raise children and not men? Right? Is that really about the choices of women and men, or is it something more ingrained in our society? And so the argument I would make is two things. First, it's largely about gender norms, right? That we still have a perception that women should raise children, right? That women should, leave their jobs, drop out of their jobs to raise children more often than men. And when surveys are done, Americans answer in this way, right? And so about a survey from 2013, about 50% of Americans said that children were better off if their mother stayed at home, right? Whereas only 34% said that they were better off if she worked. And only 8% of Americans thought it was better if the father stayed at home, right? And so there is still this incredible expectation that women should stay at home and raise their children, right? This is basic gender socialization, basic gender norms, right? That still in the 21st century, we have this idea that women should raise children, that women are more caring, that women are more nurturing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why women are dropping out of the labor market and then having less, income potential. And part of the problem is when you drop out of the labor market, when you enter back in, then now you're lagging behind, right? Now you kind of stepped out of the race. And so now your wages are lagging behind the men who've had a number of years to keep getting those promotions, right? So that's the first thing, right? That's one cause of women dropping out, just kind of gender norms, gender socialization. The second thing we can ask ourselves is, imagine you had to make a rational choice. You're a husband and wife team, you have a child, right? And you have to make a choice of somebody dropping out to take care of the child, right? So what's the rational choice a couple is going to make? Well, they're going to say, the person who earns less money, that should be the person who drops out of the labor market, and the person who has a better paying job is going to be the person who stays in. Oh, who happens to have a better paying job? Happens to be a man, right? And so again, what happens is men and women are, husbands and wives are making this rational decision, which produces an unfair and discriminatory outcome towards women, right? That women are kind of being, dropping out of the market because, men are originally getting paid more, which makes them even get paid even less. Right? And so here, it's a really, in some sense, an ethical question. Why is it that we as a society expect women to drop out of the labor market, stop earning money so that children can be raised? Right? We all need, the society needs children to be raised. Why do we expect women to do it freely? Right? Does every society expect this? No. right? So societies across the world, industrialized societies and non-industrialized societies, have maternity leave. They have weeks and weeks of maternity leave, right? This is when women will drop out of their job, will spend their early weeks and months with their child because they need around-the-clock care, and will keep getting wages, right? Um, America is unique among industrialized countries in that it has 0 weeks of maternity leave, mandated by the government. Some companies might offer it, but there's no law to enforce it, right? Whereas many other countries have weeks and weeks and weeks, 6 months, up to 6 months, in which the mother will, get paid to raise a child, because that's what society needs, right? America is the only country that expects women to do this for free. Okay, so we have here the 2 big causes: occupational segregation and workforce participation. The last thing I want to mention about workforce participation: even when women work full-time, even when women work the same number of hours as men, they still get paid less. Right? So you take a woman who works 40 hours, you take a man who works 40 hours, the women will get paid less money for those 40 hours than the men will make. Right? And actually, even as a gap and as the number of hours per week increase, the gap gets bigger. Right? So women who work 60 or more hours a week actually get paid much less than a man who works 60 or more hours a week. Right? And so it's not, workforce participation isn't really all the explanation. Right? Even when men and women are working the same number of hours for the same, educational job, men and women are getting paid less. Which brings us to our third reason. Okay, let's say that we account for everything that we can account for. Right? Let's say that we account for occupational segregation, men and women picking different jobs. Let's say that we account for workforce participation, right? The number of hours somebody works. Let's say that we account for education. Let's say we account for region. Let's say we account for a whole host of things, right? We control for lots and lots and lots of things, right? What we find is that of all these things, this only explains about 41% of the gender pay gap, right? Even when we account for all these things, there's still about a 12% difference in the wages of men and women, right? Another way to think about this is when women and men are working exactly the same job, the same number of hours, the same level of education, the same region in America, even when they're working essentially the same job, women are still getting paid less, about 12% less than men. And so the question is, well, why? What's the final explanation for why women are getting paid less than men? Right? What accounts for the rest of this gap? Gender discrimination, right? That's essentially the argument, right? When there's no other explanation left, when we can't account for it by education level, when we can't account for it by number of hours worked, essentially what's happening is women are getting paid less than men because women's work is valued less by society, right? This is straight up gender discrimination, right? And so even when we account for all the other explanations, there's still a gap between the wages of men and women, and this gap really seems to be a result of the devaluation of the work of women, and we just expect or think that they can get paid less. So we've seen, kind of, a review of economic gender pay gap, right? So kind of review of Lorber's article, then the basic facts of the gender pay gap, and then some of the, the reasons or causes of it. And it's these sources or causes that people, economists, social scientists, really argue about. I don't think anybody really argues about the facts, the data. People argue about the causes. What I would argue as a final word is, yes, it's something about people's choices, but people's choices are shaped and structured by society. Society gives people certain options and gives people certain expectations of how they're supposed to conform.